All right. Okay, we got 11 people. I can't see the chat. Let me see some. Oh yeah, the chat. Okay, the chat is on. All right. Hello, everybody. Should make sure. Yeah. All right. Okay, I can see it now. I have. Oh, I know why I can't see the chat. All right. I'm doing this on a laptop, so I might have to. I'm gonna have to flip between different screens to get from the question to the Q&A, because when I have the two things next to each other, I can't see them. I can't see your chat, guys. All right. Okay, I think we'll figure it out. All right. So, as you all know, I am still here. I am still in Charleston, South Carolina. I have about a week left. I'm totally not finished my carving, so I'm getting very stressed out because a lot of things got delayed, and also I ended up doing other stuff. I went to Toronto to do some talks, and I went to Toronto for some board meetings. I don't know if some of you know, I'm on the national board of something called 10,000 Villages, which is a series of stores that sell craft from all over the world with fair trade ideas. So when I lived in Congo and in Kenya, I worked with artisans, and so I'm still on the board. So I left for like 4 days to do that, do board meetings, and so yeah, it's just been crazy. So that's also why I'm doing this Q&A so late in the month. So I'm sorry if all of you were expecting it to be a bit early, but we made it before the last day. So well, but I really enjoying it here. We did some pumpkin carving with my kids yesterday, and so yeah, so it's a good time. All right, so I am going to go straight into your questions. There are a lot of questions today, so hopefully I'll try to get through as many as I can. But I am a bit nervous because there are a lot of them. All right, here we go. Okay, so Drew McMahon asks, what is your favorite movie and why? What symbolism does it have that sets it apart? It's funny because I don't think I actually have a favorite movie. I think I had favorite movies when I was younger, and I think since I started to kind of see the patterns more, I don't actually have favorite movies, but what I can say is that for sure, when I was younger, in my 20s, I would say in my early 20s, I really liked artsy movies and kind of art house type movies. And now I would say it's very much the opposite. I actually really like kind of big budget, stupid movies. And the reason why I like the big budget, stupid movies is that they're so much less deliberate in terms of their vision and in terms of the artistic vision. And because they're less deliberate, they often end up being more profound just because they're just trying to be successful. They're just trying to make money. And so because of that, they're just trying to appeal to the most people as they can. And in order to do that, they have to follow the patterns of human engagement. They kind of have to do that. These kind of art house movies or more artistic movies, sometimes the voice of the director is so strong, and the director is asking you to stretch yourself, that sometimes they make something which actually doesn't, let's say, capture the patterns as well as some of these big stupid movies. So that's my kind of vision of movies today. All right. Next question. Daniel Brew asks, have you read Sam Harris's book, Waking Up? I have not read Sam Harris's book, Waking Up. You guys have to understand that before I met Jordan Peterson, I could have cared less. I couldn't have cared less about Sam Harris and all the new atheists. I heard Richard Dawkins once in my 20s give a speech, and I remember the way that he was speaking and the things that he was saying. My only thoughts were, this man is not talking to me. I think I kind of know who he's talking to, maybe kind of the fundamentalist types, I guess, but he's not talking to me. So I just stopped paying attention to this new atheist crowd. And it's only because of Jordan, because, you know, when I met Jordan, he just kept talking about wanting to talk to Sam Harris. I was like, why do you want to talk to Sam Harris so much? And I was, as some of you might know, that I was at his house at the day of the second podcast that he made with him, not the first one that kind of crashed and burned, but the second one. And we actually spent a part of the day listening to the first podcast, trying to figure out what had gone wrong with his son. We're sitting there with his son and him, and so that made me kind of force me to pay attention to Sam Harris a little more, and I started listening to his podcast once in a while. But I've never read any of his books. But so Daniel talks about how Sam Harris talks about his own experience with, I don't know how to pronounce that word, Dzogchen meditation, and what happens when one turns consciousness in on itself. Care to speak on how this may compare, contrast with the idea of self-referential loop at the beginning of things? Yes, I don't know what Sam Harris says about that, but I think that that's definitely what we're talking about. And I think that my big shock at Sam Harris and my big surprise at Sam Harris is that he jumps from his experience of consciousness and this idea of kind of consciousness looking at itself and the effect that it has. He jumps from that into science, which I don't understand how he does it. And I also don't understand that if he has had those experiences where he sees consciousness looking at itself, I struggle to understand why he's not able to see that experience that he has. If you see it analogically in other spheres of reality, that is, if you see the analogy between that experience and a communal experience, let's say, that communal experience will look like something that looks like a religious ritual. It will look like something like turning around a center, like pointing towards a center, like this kind of circumambulation, you would call it. And also the same is, I also don't understand why he can't see in the stories that if you take that experience of consciousness looking at itself, what that looks like in a story, and how sacred stories have that form. Like the story of the creation in Genesis is exactly that. I mean, it is all about logos, in the sense of intelligence and language, and then a type of self-consciousness which is positive, and a type of self-consciousness which is negative. And so I almost wish I had the chance to talk to him one day to kind of take him on that path, but you know, I don't see it happening anytime soon. All right, Jesse Blaney asks, what's your least favorite Christian icon and why? Maybe this question could also imply what makes for good Christian aesthetics. My least favorite icons are Baroque icons. That is not one icon in particular, but there was a time in in Russian history, and kind of this transition between the traditional iconic style towards this more Italianate style, we'd call it, like Italian style. And I find those icons very difficult to look at because they are kind of soaking in sentimentality and a kind of excess in terms of the let's say the way that the figures are looking and the way they're moving, that I really dislike. Anything that reeks of kind of sentimentality, I usually get very cringy at. All right, Josh asks, I've heard many people liken white privilege to Gnosticism, and even calling it ethnic Gnosticism. Is that an accurate assessment in your opinion? And do you have any thoughts on the essentials of Gnosticism in order for it to be recognized in different forms? I don't totally understand what that means. What it would have to do with Gnosticism, in the sense that I at least most of my notion of Gnosticism has to do with this kind of a vision of the world that is hierarchical, but also tends to see the lower aspects of it as being somehow negative in themselves or fallen in themselves. And also this separation of spirit and body, radical separation of spirit and body, that type of thing. So I'm not sure exactly what white privilege would have to do with that, or this speaking about white privilege. I think that the white privilege question, it has mostly something to do with a vision of revolution. I think a continuation of this notion of revolution, and so it is Marxism. It is a type of Marxism which is even more dangerous than Marxism because it attaches itself to race and not just to social class. Because, in a way, you could think that at least Marxism. There's this, I don't like Marxism, obviously, but at least Marxism is just where in Marxism was this idea that, you know, once we've gotten rid of the disparate relationships of economic differences, then everything will be okay. But in this kind of weird ethnic version of white privilege, or also the way that it was seen in this notion of the four races and this hierarchy of races, I think is more dangerous because it's very it's kind of biologically rooted. There's no way to move out of those positions. Even in the caste system in India, it wasn't totally biological. There was this idea that although you are born in certain castes, it wasn't the let's say the distinction between the castes weren't completely hermetic. There were ways to move between them somewhat, and there was also ways to transcend the caste system through a form of asceticism. And so, but in this idea of white privilege, it's like you're stuck. This is your biology. You're stuck in it, and the whole idea of racism itself is a very strange biological thing where you're totally stuck with what you are. And so it's yeah, I'm not a big fan of that stuff. All right. Okay, so Jackie Rexford asks, I'd love to hear about what you have to say about the pattern of the barren woman who conceives. I think that is obviously anybody who knows a little bit about the Bible has seen that pattern is extremely important in the Bible. It repeats itself over and over and over, and it's quite simple. I mean, it's very simple to understand what is going on in that pattern, and it's basically a repetition of the pattern of creation itself. The barren woman is the primordial kind of untouched chaos. It's this notion of something which is not yet fruitful, and so you have this idea in the story of the barren woman. You also have this idea of a kind of groaning of, let's say, chaos. When I talk sometimes, I've told you guys a little, sometimes I think I've talked about this in some of my talks, that chaos is potential, and it's also a question. The feminine in that sense is potentiality, is a question. It's like, what about this, or is it possible? That's the question. Can I, or it's an asking to be fruitful. And so I think the image of the barren woman, it really is that image of, let's say, the feminine asking a question. And so in the story of the barren woman, you see it very much. And like usually the barren woman will be praying and asking God to be fruitful. And so that relationship, that's what it is. Praying is barrenness in itself. It is this asking God to manifest himself in this problem, in this question that I have. And so the story of the barren woman and then becoming fruitful is really a repetition of just the basic pattern of reality, which you find as much in, like I said, the notion of yourself asking God, and just this asking is this lack. It's this, when you ask for something, means you're missing something. It means you see the potentiality. Just the fact of knowing you miss something is like you see the potentiality, but you can't make it real, and so you ask, and that's what the pattern of the barren woman has to do with. It's really a pattern of reality. All right. Okay, so John Borden. Oh, he asked like 3 questions in a row. Let's see. You mentioned that finding proportion and creating beauty in Orthodox thought is about being finely tuned to the patterns of existence. Then you can approach perfection by embodying the patterns. The Greeks seem to have a more mechanized view of beautiful proportion using geometric relationships. Can you describe the difference, if any, between Renaissance image of beauty, Bramante's Tempietto, and an Orthodox image? Can't wait to hear your talk. Okay, so there is geometry. Geometry is pattern as well. So there is geometry in Orthodox art. There is proportion, obviously, and so the proportions can be stretched. There are different types of I can't even say that word. Different types of proportions, and so mathematics definitely has something to do with it. Now, the fact that you would use the word mechanized, I'm really a bit surprised. Like, I don't think that proportion, the idea of using geometric proportion doesn't mean mechanized. Mathematics are part of the mind of the human mind, and so they're part of our perception of reality in its most essential form. And so I don't see a contradiction. Now, the one thing I would say maybe in the icon is that, or in medieval art in general, is that there was a keen sense of the relationship between the universal and the particular, but there was a keen sense in which that balance has to be kept. That's a way that I see it. And so in the icon, for example, you take Roman art, and so in Greek icons, you take Roman art and you kind of simplify it, you make it less sensual, and so everything is kind of straightened a little bit. All the folds are kind of made to zip and not be as chaotic. But there's still that movement. There's still contrapposto in Greek in icons. There still is this slight, the figures you rarely stand straight with both knees straight. There tend to be one leg that's kind of bent. And so there is this understanding of what I've called the right hand and the left hand, that has to be part of the whole. And you see that also in architecture, for example. Church architecture has a basic structure, which is, for example, let's say a basilica structure with a narthex, nave, and the altar, and then, or in the Orthodox, they have this idea of the dome on the square. Hagia Sophia is like a dome on a square, but it's very rarely this perfect dome on a square. There's usually the basic form, which is there, but then there's also room for some fluidity on the edges and in the interpretation of the pattern. And that's really important if you want to understand the difference, let's say, between Hagia Sophia and then Islamic art, which is based on Hagia Sophia, but tends to rigidify and make it just like a dome, a square, and like it's very, or like a dome and an octagon or something extremely geometric. Whereas in Christianity, we do have that geometric base, but there's also this relationship between the kind of the universal mathematical and the particular. Now, what happens in the Renaissance and in let's say early modern art is that you start to see this swing, this balance that starts to swing. And so you have this hyper rigid system of perspective, and you have these hyper rigid systems of proportion, and then that pulls to a certain extent, and then it kind of breaks loose. Then you have something which is manneristic and something which is very emotional, very luscious, very sensual, and the proportions are less visible in the sense that there's an emphasis on flesh, like Rubens or even late Michelangelo, which he distorts the proportions. For example, if you look at Michelangelo's David, it actually is not at all a proportionate human being. His head is too big, his hands are too big, he's too thin. There's this weird distortion of the figure. And so what happens is you get this pendulum swing, which start to swing between kind of classicism, you would call it, hyper order, and then you have this kind of chaotic romantic thing that's developing, and that just keeps going back and forth all the way into modernism, where you have on one side you'll have like Mondrian on one side, and then on the other side you'll have like the abstract expressionists or the surrealists that are kind of creating chaotic images. And so you really do see this back and forth that happens. That the balance, I always say that the modern world is a de-incarnation. And because it's a de-incarnation, it swings between the universal or the spiritual and the physical, and just keeps moving back and forth instead of having this incarnational principle on which Christianity is based. So I hope that answers that question. All right. So John Borden also asks, why did you initially get into the work of Derrida? Well, and can you expand on what you got out of it, particularly his critique of modernism? Yeah, I started reading Derrida in college because I studied contemporary art and I studied in a postmodern world. And so I took a philosophy of art class, and that teacher is who introduced me to Derrida. And I kind of saw Derrida as the ultimate challenge to me because I was a Christian, especially I could say I was an evangelical Christian, and so I was in a more literal world. So I saw Derrida as like my ultimate challenge, and so I really took him on, and I read many of his books, and then I started to. He actually helped me to understand how language and patterns and how meaning cannot be limited to, or actually that the literal, this notion of literal actually doesn't exist. I keep telling people there is no literal, right? Now, I think Derrida makes some major mistakes. And obviously, if I didn't think that, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, and I wouldn't be an icon carver. I wouldn't be talking about biblical symbolism. But I think that he does help, like John, like you said, that he does help to break this type of historical critical vision of the world, that somehow you can capture the world completely in a description, in a literal sense. I even saw this, I made this video on Elisha and the she-bears, and some people on Twitter were saying, oh, I can explain it in literally, so now why do you go all around and try to find some symbolic meaning to it, because here I can explain it literally. I was like, you don't understand. You just don't understand the symbolism, because there is no separation. There is only levels of meaning, different types of levels of meaning. There is no this is the literal meaning and this is the symbolic meaning. That just doesn't work. If there was only a literal meaning, you wouldn't tell the story. There's no reason to tell the story. If you're telling the story and you're putting it in the Bible, it's because there's more than just a description of what happened. Obviously, this has meaning. So what's the meaning? All right. All right. So John, I think I'm going to skip your next question. All right. Maybe we'll get to it next time, because I haven't seen that movie. All right. All right. So we go to Brian Hylands or Hylands. All right, so if I remember correctly, you have mentioned in passing, in particular, something that you disagree with Dr. Peterson on, that Jesus' death and resurrection completely fulfills the hierarchy of all creation. That is, at every point, Christ is present. I'm curious if death itself is within this hierarchy, because if the wages of sin is death, and by sinning you are closer to death, missing the mark, aiming away from God, and Jesus Christ did in fact die, does that mean that Jesus is simultaneously the most saint and the worst of all sinners? I've always taken the Matthew 25:46 passage of, my God, why have you forsaken me, to mean that at that moment Jesus felt lost and abandoned by God. Is it at this point or at the very moment of his death when Jesus sinned? Is that possible, or am I off the deep end here? Yes, you are off the deep end. Well, yes, you are off the deep end in a certain extent. So the Christian notion is that Christ became sin without sinning. So it is a paradox. Also, there is this notion, and St. Paul talks about this very much, and he talks about how that the law causes us to sin, and that through sin we recognize, we kind of recognize that we need we need God. But then he says, does that mean that we should sin? By no means. He says, no. I'm not saying you should sin. I'm not saying sin is good. I'm not saying that this should happen. But that this idea of missing the mark, let's say, is there to help you see, in a certain extent, how you miss the mark, because you can be deluding yourself if you don't. It's like, okay, I'll give you an example of that, which is very simple to understand. You meet people who are smoking, and then they'll tell you something like, oh, I could quit anytime. I could just quit. I could quit. And it's like, the only reason why they think that is because they've never actually tried. They never actually tried to do something. And so when you try to follow the law, let's say when you say, I'm not going to smoke, or I'm not going to do this, whatever it is, passion that you've got, then all of a sudden you realize that you have no will. Like your will is zero. And so then you see that you need to be connected to something more than yourself. And so that's the idea. But I think that we have to be careful to understand there is a relationship between sin and death. If you think about my notion of hierarchy, think of the point, this idea of missing the mark as the center. In which you miss the mark, you're moving towards the edge, you're moving into non-definition, into chaos, into something that pulls you apart. And so there is that relationship. Now, the Christian notion is that Christ was somehow able to travel to the end of the world, travel to the end of death, without forgetting the center, without forgetting where he was from. And so he's able to encompass all of death into himself. Right. All right. So, all right. Another question by John Borden. John Borden's asked a lot of questions this time. He says, to feast on feast days and fast on fasting days with your family, church, and community would be such a profound and fascinating cultural shift. That level of community is exciting to imagine as a possibility. Is this something that is common in the Orthodox Church community in the West? Yes, it is. That's very much part of being an Orthodox Christian, especially during Lent, especially during the Paschal season, especially during Easter. You really do get that sense that everybody's kind of in this together, and everybody is making efforts, and everybody is also going to confession more. And so you can see it happening, people around you attending more church services, and then finally celebrating the Feast of the Resurrection altogether. Okay, Vesper Stamper asks, Jonathan, I went to Divine Liturgy for the first time last week and met with a priest for 3 hours later that week. Wow. My first time up close with icons other than in museum, a total paradigm shift. I'm looking for an icon of St. Mary of Paris. I came across the work of Robert Lentz. I'm wondering if you're familiar. He's admitted not being comfortable in either Catholicism or Orthodoxy because of his social liberalism. His icons depict such non-saints as Harvey Milk and Albert Einstein. Your thoughts? I really, really don't like Robert Lentz's work. Like, seriously. I think Robert Lentz is seriously problematic for many reasons. One reason is precisely for the reason Vesper said, is that no matter what you think, like, we as individuals don't get to decide who are saints because we like them. And being a saint doesn't mean someone who you like their political ideas, or you like what scientific formula they came up with, or you like their music, or you like. Being a saint doesn't mean that you like someone. Being a saint means reaching a certain ontological level of being, in which Christ appears to the world through, in which the Logos shines through that person, and then a community receives that image, and the community recognizes that image. In the church, you always have this idea that there's something coming from on high and there's something coming from below. And so you have a light from above and you have a reception from below. You have a pronouncement from above and you have an amen from below. So that amen is that recognition. So you can't decide to make icons of Harvey Milk or of Albert Einstein or of John Coltrane or whoever it is that Robert Lentz decides to make icons of. And he's doing it in a very provocative manner, in a way that is extremely political, which is sad, because we hope that our saints and that our Christianity can transcend politics. He's being very divisive in his manner, and he's also using the tropes of iconography in a manner which is not at all respectful of the tradition out of which he takes it. And so on the one hand, he says that he's this like liberal, he's like a liberal gay monk. I don't know, like, he's like a gay liberal monk in the Anglican tradition, and he's super open to all kinds of cultures. He represents Christ as a Native American. He represents Christ as a Mexican refugee. He represents Christ as all these things that fit into the liberal, let's say, bastion. But he doesn't respect the language of iconography itself, which has parameters which have been established, for 1,500 years. and he just throws it out the window because it fits his political agenda. And I find that very disturbing. So, for example, the idea of representing Christ as a like they say as a Native American chieftain or something like that. I understand why he wants to do that, but that is very problematic in terms of the icon, because the icon has, one of the aspects of the icon is that it has to be recognized. That is, Christ, in the tradition, Christ is described in a certain manner. Now, you can say it's not historical or whatever, but the image of Christ has been received by the church, and we know what it is. He has long hair, he has a beard, he has dark eyes. He wears. We show him wearing Roman clothing. That is the image that has been received by the church and has been systematically portrayed since the year 300. And so maybe not the beard part. The beard part took a little while to settle in, but it definitely did finally settle in. But then to just say that you want to represent Christ as completely from another culture, your icons are testimonies of the incarnation. They're not just ideological things. And so, although it's true that I can find Christ in a Native American chieftain, I can encounter Christ in all human beings. But when we represent Christ in the icon, it's a witness to the historical incarnation of Christ. That's also part of what the icon is. And so if I just represent Christ to my fancy based on some political ideal or some kind of politically correct vision of the world, then I am in a certain manner playing with this notion of the incarnation. Here we do have this kind of weird Gnostic idea, which is that this is an icon of Christ, but it's not an icon of Christ. It's an icon of some other person who you put a halo with a cross on, but that's not the image that has been received by the church as being the image of Christ. So hopefully that's understandable. Sorry if that sounded a little bit like a rant. All right, so Cam asked, do you have a schedule for your travels and speaking engagements posted online anywhere? I think some of you know, I do have a website now. It's thesymbolicworld.com, and I'm going to be posting all the schedule of my travels and speaking engagements there. Right now, I just have the month of November up because that's coming right very soon. But in January, I'm going to be in Saskatoon. I'll be posting that soon. I just need the details. And then I'm also soon going to be in Texas. I might be speaking in Colorado, in California, but all of these haven't been totally fixed yet, the date. So as soon as the dates are on, I will put that on my website, and hopefully I'll be announcing it at the end of videos as well. All right. So Khalidel asks, how are time horizons represented within iconography? Could you discuss the patterns of life figured in the stories that elaborate them, please? All right, I'm gonna just answer that because there's a lot of questions. Kind of what. So how are time horizons represented within iconography? That's an interesting question because let's say in terms of time, time is represented very particularly in iconography. Time can be compressed into one image, and so you can have. That's a great thing about an image, is that it can compress time. And so if you look at the traditional icon, the crucifixion, for example, you will have Christ on the cross. Usually he'll be shown as dead on the cross. And then you'll see at the same time, the Mother of God and St. John on either side. So it's also representing when Christ said to his mother, "This is your son," and to St. John, "This is your mother." Then you'll often see the Roman soldier who's kind of looking up and saying, "This is truly the Son of God." You'll see the blood of Christ going down onto the skull of Adam, which is representing Christ's descent into Hades and his saving of Adam. And so you can compress time in icons. Sometimes you'll even show in icons almost like a comic book. They'll show different scenes. So, for example, you can look at the icon of the Nativity. And so in the icon of the Nativity, you have, everybody's there. You have the Mother of God in the cave with Christ, and then you see the wise men, and you see the angels singing above, and you see the star as well, and then you see the shepherd, and it's like obviously all of that didn't happen at the same time in the story, but it's like this compression of all the elements of the Nativity into one image. And that's what's great about iconography, is that you can do that, and it can help you see patterns in a geometric sense rather than in time. It can help you also sometimes understand those patterns in time when you see them laid out on an image, because you can sometimes find a certain higher representation. All right. All right, so Cam asked, please explain the nature of the analogies you have discovered between popular storytelling and the biblical stories. Take, for example, your analysis of the backstory in Batman and the fall of Adam and Eve. I really enjoyed your explanation of the parallels. How one maps onto the other, as you say, but is this intentional, do you think, on the part of the comic books author, or is there a deep psychological archetype common to both? All right, are the biblical accounts somewhat hardwired into our psyche, such as they inevitably show up in popular storytelling? Of course, we don't know what the creative intent is, so this will be somewhat speculative. But what do you think is probably going on? I don't recall that you have usually identified the relationship. All right, so there are a few things going on. One is that I believe, I've said this a few times, is that I believe that the patterns that you find in the Bible are the patterns of reality. That is, they are the patterns of how we encounter the world. And so that's why they resonate so much. That is, the man, especially the first chapter of Genesis, the manner in which the world is described, the creation of the world, it is actually a map of how the world lays itself out to us. The hierarchy of the world, and this idea of separating into categories, pulling out a potential through intelligence and through mind and through speech, pulling out a potential into these specific categories. And so that's what I think. And so then what happens is that once the pattern is kind of behind the story. And so once you see the pattern, you can see it when you look at each other. You start to see the pattern. You look at the first chapter of Genesis, then you look at the rest of Genesis, then you look at how those patterns come back into the historical books, and then you look at Christ and you see how those patterns all come together. You kind of see it. So in a certain manner, it doesn't really matter whether or not the people were intentional about it, because, like I said, those are the patterns of our so it's like, so let's say Batman, for example. So when they created, let's do it this way. When Batman was created, there were dozens of other comic books being created at the same time. I don't even know how many, maybe 100 comic books being created at the same time. Okay. Now, the question is, why did that character survive? It survived because it tapped into something which captured people's attention for longer than all the other comic books that vanished. Okay. Now, that's how. So then that comic book, let's say Batman and a few others, they have more of the pattern, of the right pattern, or call it attunement to the pattern. Let's say they have more attunement to the pattern, and that's why they continue in our story. That's why we continue to pay attention to them. That's why we continue to refer to them. Okay, and so you can take that in a very, very long scale, and then it keeps getting weaned down, and also those patterns are refined. And so let's say the Batman that Bob Kane created had something very particular that grabbed people's attention, and then as it was refined, elements were added to the story. Some elements survive, some elements fall apart. For example, a good example is like this idea that when the Bruce Wayne's parents were killed, that you see the necklace, Martha Wayne's necklace, breaking and falling to the ground. It's like, that wasn't, as what I know of, that wasn't in like Bob Kane's original idea of Batman, or even later. I think it was Frank Miller who added that into the story, but that element somehow kind of grabbed people's imagination. And this idea of a world, let's say, a string of possibilities, or a string of pearls, of these precious things that are attached together into one circle, that are held together. The fact that this image of this string of pearls, or this string of worlds, or this coherent world that is broken apart and fragments into all these broken pieces, these broken things that fall into the ground. Also, this idea of something, all these precious things that now are broken and fall into the alley. It's like that image grabbed people's attention because it tapped into that universal thing. Okay, so that's how it works. It doesn't mean that those people necessarily, sometimes they do, it's possible. I mean, I know when I write a story, I definitely think about that stuff. Sometimes it's also people like let's say the creators of Batman. I think Bob Kane was Jewish. Not sure, possibly. A lot of some of the creators, one of the creators of Superman was Jewish, or I think they're both. Not even sure, but like that means that they would have had that also encultured in them, and it would be like this unconscious pattern that was running in the back of their mind as well. So sometimes it can be deliberate without being conscious. I could say like it's something that comes out of that culture. All right. All right, so completely separate. So David Alexander also asked, do you have any thoughts on the significance of Christ's garments being woven in one piece? That one is from my wife. Hope that's not cheating. The idea of that's a very difficult thing to totally understand. The idea of Christ's garment not being ripped has something to do also with the idea that his bones were not broken. So this notion, it was really important to specify that Christ's bones were not broken, that his garment was not ripped. And so there's something about the possibility of the fact that he held on to the center, held on to the solid inner part, and then also that even the mesh was not broken, that even the outer covering held together. And it has something to do with obviously it has something to do with resurrection, and it has something to do also with this idea of the gates of hell will not prevail on the church. There's something to do with that, something to do with how even though St. Peter denied Christ, even though St. Peter sank into the water, all of that, that somehow there's still the possibility of preserving, of things staying together. That's as much as I can say about that, because I have to be honest that I've been thinking about this question for a long time, and I feel like I haven't even scratched the surface of that symbolism. All right. All right. So Tanner Mathis asked about in the life of Moses the idea that St. Gregory of Nyssa talks about God assigning us an angel to aid the person, and also a corrupter who tortures the life of men and plots against their nature, right? And so he says this seems to be strange that God would assign each person a demon. And so he said that he saw that I talked about it in my Life of Moses video. Those who are interested in getting some details about that, you can watch it. But he wonders why God would assign us a demon. I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to answer that besides that that's how it is. And anybody who thinks that's not how it is just deluding themselves in terms of how reality works. So I can't answer why God would do what God does, because that's just I don't see why I would answer that question, although I'm not even sure I know what that question means. But what I could say is that vision of reality is definitely real in terms of how we experience this hierarchy of our being, how we experience something pulling us down, and then something also encouraging us above. And so I think that the imagery of the angel and the demon is really the best imagery we can use to talk about that. And this idea that you have these wills inside you, or let's say a will towards destruction and a will towards life inside us. I think that anybody who's honest has experienced that. So that's as much as I can give you on that. I will not dive into the inner the inner workings of the divine mind. All right, can you tell a bit more about the symbolism of Genesis 43 and 44? There is much going on. There's a famine going on, a feast, heavy drinking, bags of grain, and an empty cup, along with Joseph's double deception. Not being his true self, putting the cup in Benjamin's bag. What do all things mean? Guys, I've been telling you for the past 2 years about the double inversion. I mentioned it many times. This idea that resurrection comes with a double inversion. That is a trick and then a trick upon a trick. And so that's what's going on in that story. And that's what I mean when I talk about the double inversion. When I talk about, for example, if those of you listen to, I recently put out as a podcast the talk I gave in Vancouver a year ago on the ragtag heroes of the inverted world. And I talk about the trickster and how the trickster turns things upside down, but when things are already upside down, the trickster turns things right side up. And so this idea that at the end, before Israel is saved, let's say it that way, before Israel is saved, at the end, there is a trick. And I can't believe I'm saying this. And the chosen one, the chosen one is hiding in foreigners' garments, that the children of Israel cannot recognize their own savior, and that the savior has become almost fully Egyptian. And it's all and then at the end there's a total final flip where, you know, where that's how salvation comes. That's all I can say. But I would say just pay attention to that pattern, because this double inversion is kind of building up right now in the world. And so we have to be, I can't say how it's going to turn out. I don't know how it's going to turn out, because it is a trick upon a trick. And so I don't know, but I would just say, just be attentive to that. Yeah. All right. So Gavin Dottie says, I'd like to know why the Holy Spirit descends like a dove at Christ's baptism. Also, why can the Holy Spirit be symbolized in this manner while portrayals of the Father are frowned upon? Well, the Holy Spirit descends like a dove at Christ's baptism to help to connect this to the story of Noah. Because after the flood, after the death, Noah sends the dove out, and the dove descends and finds what's in between the water and the sky, which is this dry earth, land, habitable earth. Okay. And so Christ coming out of the water is that connection between heaven and earth, the mountain, you could say. Okay. So Christ is that mountain between the waters and heaven. He connects them together. He is that hierarchy. I've always said Christ is the total hierarchy. He's not just at the top of the hierarchy, he's the total hierarchy. And so Christ is that mountain. And then, so this idea that he's in the water, and then the heavens in the shape of a dove, in the spirit or breath, doves, bird, spirit, all those are the same. So it descends and lands on Christ. And you can kind of imagine Christ standing in the water, and then with this bird, this spirit, this breath, this spiritual aspect sitting upon him and showing that he is the connection between heaven and earth. He's that dry land. He's the mountain by which the world will start anew. And then so we show the Holy Spirit symbolized in this manner because he was symbolized in this manner in Scripture. And we know that it's not a iconic representation. It's not a representation of the person of the Holy Spirit, because we've never seen the Holy Spirit, but it is a symbol. And a lot of iconographers today actually frown upon using the image of the dove to represent the Holy Spirit in any other place except for the baptism of Christ. So that's how strict people can be. I don't tend to be that strict, but I understand why they're saying that, because they want to avoid a personal representation of the Holy Spirit. The only personal representation of the divine we have is the image of Christ because of the incarnation. All right. As you can see, if you don't know, I'm in Charleston, and I'm drinking all these amazing Charleston beers here. I'm discovering this whole world of sour beers. I never had that really before. So I'm discovering all this through my friend where I'm staying at here. All right. So Riz Oliver asks, what is the role of disagreeable people in church? I think that most people of my temperament are very likely to become atheists, but I thought, but if tough-minded people, say like Joe Rogan, get into the church, what then? Are we like gargoyles on the outside of the church? No. There's plenty of roles for disagreeable people in the church. There are plenty of saints that were disagreeable. Saint Athanasius, who I put his book in my recommended books on my website, was really disliked by everybody around him. Another example, Saint Cyril of Alexandria was so disliked by people around him that, I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but when he died, some people put this giant rock in front of his gravestone so that at the resurrection of the dead, he couldn't get out. I'm sorry, Saint Cyril, that's horrible, but seriously, it is funny. It is funny. I have to say that that is funny. So there is definitely room for disagreeable people. Disagreeable people are the type of people in Christianity that say no, I'm not budging. I don't care what you would like Christianity to be. I don't care because if your feelings are hurt because God is like this, and you don't like the fact that this is what Christianity teaches. This is what Christianity teaches. That's it. Get over it, right? That's the role of disagreeable people in the church. And that was exactly the role that St. Athanasius and St. Cyril of Alexandria played. All right. Man, am I going to get through these? There's a lot of questions. Oh no, okay. I think I'm almost I'm at the end of the Patreon questions. All right. Okay. So Jacob Russell asks, is there a common thread concerning hair within biblical text? You've mentioned probably making a video about this, but I'm impatient and persistent. The video would be good instead though. So you know what, Jacob, because I like Jacob, and he's been awesome at he's just been awesome at running the Facebook group. I will make a video on that. I promise, all right? And I will answer that in full. But I would just want to say that it has to do with the relationship between death and glory. That's what hair has to do with. So it's both. It's both death and glory. So you maybe have a little bit of a thread going, and think about that, and hopefully that'll be enough for now. All right. Okay, so David Flores asks, you've been talking about the world being upside down and the end of a cycle quite a bit in your videos. Is there a difference symbolically between an ark and resurrection, insofar as baptism reflecting the flood? How does one know when to walk on the waters, whether versus diving below? That's a really, really interesting question. I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know how to answer that question. I think that there sometimes those two can be the same in a certain manner in terms of the symbolism. That this idea of the important part is the idea of making it through the flood. Let's see it that way. The importance is the capacity to make it through the waters. And so walking on waters has to do with this idea of mastering, let's say, this chaos. But then resurrection also has to do with that, because resurrection does just mean standing up again. So this idea of standing up again, coming out of the water, standing on the water, all of that is related. So I think the important part is really this idea of crossing over. But it's a really good question, David. You know what? I'm going to keep thinking about that, because I don't feel like I'm totally answering your question. enough. So I'm going to think about it. Maybe this will be a good reason for a video. All right. Okay. So John Borden asks one last question. If it's not too provocative, how do you think the character of Trump fits into the biblical stories or the patterns of the world? You guys. All right. What do I think of Trump? Okay. Oh, man. I think that Trump has to do with this carnival world. I think that I talk about the world being upside down. Part of the upside down world, which I was really hoping to make a video on Halloween, but I just don't have the time to do it this year. Maybe next year. The whole idea of the carnival has to do with upside down. And so Trump is definitely a manifestation of the carnival. There is something about him which is something of the actor, something of the entertainer, the boasting. All of that has to do with this kind of clownish upside down world, and he's definitely a manifestation of that. Now, the question is, this is the question. The question is, there are characters in the Bible that are that, and then they are this flip where they manifest that, but then they flip it into something positive. King David is a perfect example. King David is an entertainer. King David dances naked before the ark. He acts insane. He pretends to be an enemy of Israel. He also marries other people's wives, systematically marries other people's wives. And so there's something of that, I think, happening, going on in this Trump phenomena. But I can't tell you which way it's going to go. I don't know whether, I'm not totally sure whether he's just a clown. How can I say that? Let's say it this way. I don't know whether he's Nero or David. That's what I don't know. He could be king. He could be Nero, who loved to entertain, who was a man of the people, who went out and danced and sang and did all that stuff, but was a total wretch. And King David, who also did all that stuff, but then established Jerusalem as the holy city. So, all right. When I said that, I saw in my mind that Trump had made Jerusalem the capital of Israel, and then I'd put I'd put the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem, and I was like, oh man, I don't know which one it is. It's not me. It's not for me to decide, anyways. Because I really dislike him. I have to be honest. I really dislike Trump as a person in so many ways. But also, he really makes me laugh. Sometimes really makes me laugh. So yeah, that's it. But if you ask me if I had to choose between Trump and Justin Trudeau, for example, my own prime minister, that's a tough call. All right. Okay. So almost done. All right. Laura Gilles asks. All right. I'm gonna skip some of these. Okay. Now, Laura Gilles asked, I'm very curious about a reference made in your brother's book in a footnote. Ancient forms of medicine are still practiced today, which sheds considerable doubt on the supremacy of modern medicine. Ironically, that which modern medicine always dismisses as the placebo effect is precisely the subtle influence which it is ill-equipped to handle. These are self-referential influences of renewal. Can you explain and expound upon this quote? All right. I'm doing research on the theology of healing and want to know more about what he is getting at there. Now, this question is about the relationship. The problem with the way that medicine is viewed today is that they view the human person as just something that is outside of ourselves to analyze, which it isn't. The human body isn't something outside of outside we're analyzing. It is something, it is ourself. And so there is a strangeness about treating the human person or the human body as a foreign thing to analyze, and disassociating the relationship between our conscious experience and the human body. And so this idea that we dismiss the placebo effect is exactly the problem, is that we act as if the relationship between consciousness and belief and language and perception, or let's say conviction, how that plays into our own healing, and then we don't actually use that. We pretend as if it's just not important, as if it's something that shouldn't be part of medicine. But it's real. If you're healed by the placebo effect, you're actually healed, and that's what really matters. And so this idea that certain types of ancient medicine that have more to do with certain analogies, let's say, that are akin to consciousness, that is, we have experiences of analogies in the world that we talk about. So people will say something that, you know, how people used to have magical thinking, where they thought that because something is a certain color or has certain analogy to something else, therefore it will have the effect it does. And so, like, the cliche right now would be like, you know, if you're impotent and you eat rhinoceros horn, right, because that's hard and pointy, then you'll cure your impotence. So the modern scientist mocks that and says, no, it won't. Like, obviously it won't, but maybe it does. Maybe it does cure your impotence, but maybe it doesn't do it through your method of biological transformation, and maybe it does it through the analogies and our conscious perception of that analogy, and how that will then trigger what we call the placebo effect and have the effect that we want it to have. Does that make sense? Once you start to take consciousness back into your consideration of how the human being works, then all of a sudden you can't ignore these analogies that we see in the world, that we see and that are real because we engage the world with that analogy. And so the idea, for example, like some people would say that, you know, you can't, let's say that you're healed by light, let's say. I don't know what it could be. Like, you're healed by light, and I don't know anything about these medicines, but, and so the scientists might study the thing and say, you know, well, we can't find a biological reaction, and we can't find this and that. But it's like, the idea that light would heal somebody is so close to all our analogies between how we see the sky as the source of the sun, how the sun is the source of our life, and how, you know, when we're in the dark, we don't know where we're going. When we have light, then we know what we're doing and we know what's going on. And so it's like, maybe someone who develops some medicine based on light could actually heal someone even without any form of tradition, like any form of biological cause effect. But the cause effect would be cause effect in consciousness, which is linked to how our body reacts. So that's what it is. I don't know like how far I can go. I'm not I don't live in the Middle Ages. I don't know about that stuff. When I read about ancient healing, I find it as strange as anybody else. But I'm also not stupid enough to just think that for thousands of years, all doctors were charlatans who didn't know like what they were doing. And just now we've discovered ways of healing people. I think that is very presumptuous on our part. All right. Okay. Sarah Hardy asked, can you discuss the perpetual virginity of Mary? Why this is important symbolically and how it applies to the church? Okay. Wow. This is I could definitely make a video, but the notion of perpetual virginity is important in establishing the untouched aspect of the lower part of creation. So heaven and earth. And so you have to see it this way. You have to see it as if in order for for Mary to have had God in her womb, she needed to be the most untouched. I hope that's making sense to you. She needed to be prime matter. She needed to be primordial, the primordial matrix, you could say, right? And she also needed to be able to have Christ in her womb, manifest Christ without compromising the primordial matrix, preserving this primordial untouched potential, right? And so that is this notion of perpetual virginity, which means that she is virgin mother. And that's what's important. It's important not to say that she's perpetual virgin. She is perpetually virgin mother. And she is not just the mother of Christ, but she's the mother of all of us. Okay. And so that's what it is. And so that's how I see it, at least. And I hope that makes sense. That might be a little bit esoteric for some of you, but that's as close as it's going to get for now. All right. So Matthew Nagel asks, is there anything in Matthew's book that you disagree with? You guys are looking to start a fight between me and my brother. Yes, I do think there is one thing that I disagree with in Matthew's book, but I think that I disagree mostly with just the formulation maybe that he used, because Matthew is maybe less familiar with some of the way that Christian theologians have represented things. I think that I disagree with the parts that Matthew talks about how God is let's say the origin of evil, something like that, or that God is the something like that, that God causes evil. And I understand why he says that, because there are definitely texts in the Bible that say something like that. But I think that the Christian formulation, the way that we formulate it in terms of Christianity, is really this idea of a lack, and so that evil is seen as an absence, or as an absence of good, or like this kind of this looking at something, a twisting of something good. And so when I read that, I was kind of like, oh, you might run into problem with Christians writing that. And so I think that was probably in the whole book, that's the only thing that I found problematic. Everything else, I think it's definitely, I mean, it's definitely the book that everybody should read. That's for sure. And I wish more people were reading it. All right. Okay. I'm going to go into the questions in the chat and see if I've got. All right. So Brad Ward asked if I have a good primer on the concept of logos. Just start with the Greek philosophers. I would say St. Maximus the Confessor. That's the way. There's a book that's called, you could just look up, there are some good books. You can buy secondary sources on St. Maximus the Confessor. There's a book by Andrew Louth, which is just called St. Maximus the Confessor, I think. And I think that's a really, really good introduction. Hi, Jonathan. What do you make of the political inversion happening? Liberals are becoming authoritarian and conservatives are becoming liberal. What explains this? The world is upside down, people. The world is very confused right now. It's going to get worse before it gets better. That's for sure. And at least until now, a lot of it has been in the funny part of it, but might not last long. Things might get tricky. So, yeah. Jeffrey Muter asks, if Santa exists, do the mythological gods also exist, since we live out their particular stories, constantly reviving them in media? And is this a conflict with Christianity? I think the mythological gods exist. Um, I think that the proper way to formulate their existence in Christian terms is to say they're demons, and I've explained that before. I explained it in the sense that because they are not pointing towards the hierarchy, the divine hierarchy, that they're not pointing towards the center of the story in which we are participating, then they are demonic in the sense that they are fragments and they are fragmentary and they pull things they pull things away. But it doesn't mean that we can't get some insight from their stories, because they are principalities. And so it's important to, I think it's important to pay attention to those stories. But that is definitely, but the fact that they are demons in that sense, that the fact that they are kind of residues, kind of chaotic residues of a former world, and they also kind of pull the world apart. And I think they let's say, you can see that the Romans were trying to find some kind of, Sol Invictus. They're trying to find this notion of a unifying thing, because they could see that all these different gods and, all these different cultures, all these different gods was very problematic. They're trying to unify things in the worship of the emperor and this notion of Sol Invictus. You see it in the time of Diocletian, but it was kind of artificial. It wasn't a real story. And so Christianity came and filled that need, where it gave the world a coherent hierarchy and a coherent story to enter into. And then the figure of Christ became, that union of heaven and earth, that is far more real than the emperor. And you can see it in the gospel. You see, in the beginning of, I forget which gospel it is. The beginning of the Gospel of St. Luke, I think. I'm not sure. That it says in the time of Caesar, of Augustus Caesar, and Caesar Augustus was called the Son of God. You see that in the poetry around Augustus, and the worship of the emperor began with Augustus, and Christ was there. So in the text in the Bible, you have this sense that Christ is represented as the Son of God, but you also have Augustus kind of. It's really this subtext. It's very far in the subtext that Augustus is also the Son of God. So you have these two sons of God, and so one of them is this humble, the humble Christ who changed the world and was elevated to be the highest. And then there's Augustus, who is this political figure. And so it turns out that they were kind of moving towards this idea of the worship of the Son of God, but they were seeing it just in a political sense. I think Christ came and filled in that need for a regular, like an actual story you can live in, and that could encompass all the good aspects of Greek philosophy, of the best of Stoicism. All of that could kind of enter into it, which they were struggling to do at the time of Diocletian, and after that. Anyway, that is my vision of it. All right. Antonia Blatchford asked if I'm familiar with I Ching, and curious what you think of it from a symbolic perspective. I know very little about it, so I probably shouldn't say anything. I know some people who have studied in great detail and said that it's a very, very cohesive symbolic language, but I would definitely not be speaking. It's way too complicated for me to say anything about that. Okay, so Kurt Diamond asked me a few provocative questions. If Christ is the only person who can really accurately explain himself to someone, what are you talking about? Don't you need to be speaking on behalf of the church, or to be educating on behalf of the church, to be educating about Christ? rather than just sharing your ideas? Or is that all that is happening here? Idea sharing. Isn't this material supposed to be expounded on by a priest, or is it enough that you are just in the church? Genuine question. I'm not Orthodox, so I don't know how the difference between speaking about Christ and speaking about an unrelated idea people think is about Christ. Is that heresy? Well, I could say two things about that. One thing is something in the Orthodox Church, which is called theologumenon, which is that we understand that people speak theological ideas and think theological thoughts, but they don't necessarily speak with authority of the church. And so the authority, the church manifests itself through its saints, through its canons, through its official pronouncements by its authorities. And so that is definitely not what I'm doing. I am doing something which you would call theologumenon, which is discussing about theology. That is the first thing I can say. The second thing I can say is that I have asked and received the blessing of my priest to do this. And so, and I have also asked other priests who I trust to watch me very carefully and to pay attention to the things I'm saying and to smack me across the head if I start saying things that are off keel. And so I think that's very important. I do place myself under the authority of the church. And if my bishop or if my priest or if a priest that is can appeal to is my authority. I wouldn't just listen to any priest who just comes to me. But I mean, if I would say though, if any priest came to me and had serious criticism about what I'm doing, then I would go to my priest and to my bishop and say, this is what I've been told by this priest. What do you think he's right? Should I do something about it? Should I change some of the things I'm saying? And so I am very comfortable submitting myself to the authority of the church. And until now, I have not yet been I've had some priests say that they disagree with me and that they don't like that I'm friends with Jordan Peterson. I've had priests say that they don't want to associate with me because I'm friends with Jordan Peterson, but I haven't had anybody criticize something I have said directly yet. So if that happens, then I'll talk to my priest, talk to my bishop. If I have to, I'll go to confession. And if I still have the blessing of my priest, then I'll keep going. All right. All right. Sean Doyle talks about the seamless garment. All has to do with Christ as high priest, as the Levitical priest wore seamless liturgical dress. Yeah, it's very interesting. That's a very good idea. I hadn't thought about that, but that probably one of the reasons why we have this idea that he has a seamless garment. It doesn't totally explain why it was important that his garment not be ripped, and why also his garment was cast by lots. I always think that the fact that Christ's garment was cast by lots by Romans was a prophecy speaking about the conversion of Rome and how Christianity was going to move out towards the periphery and would become the religion of the Roman Empire rather than the religion of the Jews. That has always been kind of my vision of it. All right, guys. So that is all. We've gotten through all the questions. I can't believe I was able to get through all that. So yeah, not bad. I feel like I didn't say anything too crazy this time. Hopefully, I have to listen to myself again tomorrow and see what I sound like. So once again, guys, I totally appreciate everything you guys have, all the support you've been giving to me. There's so much going on. Like I said, I'm going to get back in November. I have many talks which I recorded in Toronto. I just had the audio though, and I'm not sure how to do this. I feel always annoyed when I just have the audio because I feel like putting up the audio on YouTube can be a bit unpleasant. And so I don't know what you think. If you think that it's worth it, I probably will do it anyways. And then then people can just deal with it the way they do. Maybe put a few images on top, like move some images around. I'm working on the next movie type interpretation. It's taking longer because I'm actually doing like the symbolism of aliens, of extraterrestrial, kind of all together. So it's like I'm using the movie Alien, but I'm also talking about aliens in general. So it's taking a bit longer than I planned to even just write the script of it, because I'm kind of working at it on different levels. So I'm working on that. And so Adam says it's worth putting out the talk. So I will put them out. I'll try to put them out as soon as I can. And the talks in Montreal, a lot of them are in French, so I probably won't putting those out unless all of you guys want to hear some French talks. But yeah, that's what's going on. So don't forget that these talks are all my videos, not all my videos, but all the videos that are not movie interpretations are getting put out on my podcast. So if you want to just listen to the stuff, it's good. I haven't been very good at kind of promoting the podcast, but yeah, go ahead and check out the podcast, share it and stuff, because I'm just haven't been very good at getting the word out about the podcast. The other thing that's happening too is I'm working. I'm going to be working on on trying to get all my videos on other platforms, because yeah, I really don't. There's a lot of things going on, like a lot of weird censorship things happening kind of in the background, and you can see people's people getting taken down on YouTube and on Twitter. And I think that what I'm saying is not very political. It's religious, and it is kind of traditional. It's not very political, but it's hard to know how far this is going to go, because it seems like it's not going to stop, and it's going to get worse. And so so I probably will be putting my stuff out on other platforms, so just in case the waters start getting warmer and warmer. So look forward to that. And all right, guys. So it was good to talk to you guys. Thanks for coming out, and see you next month.